Dominating the news for the last couple of weeks has been the fiasco over the South African budget. We first had our Minister of Finance not, for the first time ever, not deliver his budget speech when it was meant to be delivered. And then we've had a whole lot of actions. And central to that part was the Minister's intention to raise VAT by 2 percentage points from 15 to 17%. That was sent away. He came back with another proposal to increase VAT by 1% spread over 2 years. That was also sent away, and there's been actions which we followed quite closely on the State of the Nation. So let's talk to somebody who is right in the middle of everything, and that is the Democratic Alliance's spokesman for finance, and the Dr. Mark Burke, who said I mustn't call him Dr. Mark Burke, so we'll just call him Mark Burke. Mark, welcome to the State of the Nation. So glad that you made it here.
Mike, it's a privilege to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, good, man. So you've been in the middle of this all, haven't you? It's been fun and games. It's been quite a time.
I wouldn't want to overstate my role in all of this. I am but a humble backbench MP articulating from time to time the party's position on finance. We, of course, have some very competent people who've been pulled into the executive rank. One of them is Asher Sarupin, the country's Deputy Minister of Finance. And behind the scenes, Asher has done so much to try and get this budget to a sensible place. And so it would be amiss to not at least acknowledge that effort.
Okay, so let's talk about Asher Sarupin, because I think we must get him on here as well to speak for himself. So let's go back to the first failed budget speech by Enoch Godongwana, our Minister of Finance, who I don't hold in as high regard as everybody else seems to, given his track record from before. But his deputy minister, he's got two of them. One of them is from the DA, Asher Sarupin. Did he not know anything about this 2%, the proposed 2% budget increase that was meant to come through on the first speech?
I'll preface the answer by saying I don't know the exact inner workings of Treasury, and that's as it should be. A lot of the information discussed there is at times, in the opinion of Treasury, market sensitive. Asher would have had advance knowledge. But something we need to be unequivocal about is from the first time this was mentioned, the DA's position, Asher's position, our leadership's position, was that this cannot be supported. So from the first time this came up, Asher said unequivocally, we cannot support the VAT increase. Soon thereafter, our federal leadership met with the ANC, indicated the same thing. And that happened throughout, including the cabinet meeting of the failed first budget attempt, and at every juncture thereafter. We've been very firm on what can happen here and what can't, and South Africans are overburdened, and it is not the DA's position to support any form of tax increase.
Yeah, because what I'm trying to get to is this idea that it was 2 hours before the speech was meant to happen that suddenly everybody heard about it for the first time, that he intended to raise VAT. Was that actually the case, or had this been discussed but been sort of turned down and the expectation was that it wasn't going to happen?
Well, the difficulty is I don't know what the ANC discussed with the smaller parties that are part of the GNU. But what I can tell you is at least 2 weeks beforehand, this conversation started coming up. And just to be clear, this is a departure from a midterm budget agreed upon at the end of last year. So you've got this policy statement that says, where are we going? What are we doing? And some of the things that we all agreed on in there, which were, the result of negotiating between the two biggest parties, is to say that we can't have any more bailouts for state-owned enterprises when they've performed so abysmally, and we can have no form of increased taxation. And then a new thought developed with the Minister of Finance, and he admits this freely, that he woke up one morning saying he won't stand for another austerity budget, and he went ahead to propose a 2% VAT increase. And from every juncture where that came up, we opposed it, including on the grounds that it was a departure from what we had all agreed to at the end of last year.
Yeah. So now there's complete, all the GNU partners agree this VAT increase is a bad idea. Even the minister agrees, and then laughably even the ANC agrees, which of course is laughable and should be called out for the hypocrites that they are, that they say they don't agree what their own guy has put forward. Now, the minister was sent away and given time to change this and do something about it. In that time, as the second biggest party in the GNU, did you have discussions with all your GNU partners about, about this situation?
Yeah, again, I'm not in every bilateral conversation that the DA has there's a role for our leadership to play in engaging with other parties. I think the other thing to point out here, and I do want to answer your question in a moment, the other thing to point out here is this is done now.
Yeah.
We had to go to court to stop this, but it's not our preferred outcome. It's the route we had to pursue because we were not being considered in the approach to this budget, which I think is a result of a way of doing things, which even in the most generous interpretation of how the ANC goes about conducting themselves, has not been consultative enough for the new democratic environment we find ourselves in, where they control 39% of the seats. But what we don't want to do at this juncture is rub anybody's noses in what happened here and where parties failed and where parties within the GNU decided to go with this fiscal framework that include. We are now at a juncture where the court has spoken and we need to find ways to constructively come up with a budget that will serve South Africa. Now, the position of this government is that we need to move away from consumption spending and focus on investment spending, meaning we are creating the infrastructure that allows business over time to create opportunities for South Africans. And while we're doing that, we need to start getting value for money. So we need to make sure that where we spend on infrastructure, that we're not overpaying because our procurement is so broken. So we need an efficient government that creates infrastructure. Those infrastructure investments will create jobs, and jobs and economic growth is the number one priority for this government, and the reason why the DA has staked its reputation in forming part of this government. So I want to be very clear that whatever conversations happened until Monday, when the court has spoken, is not as important as what we do from this point forward.
Okay, because the reason that I'm trying to get those steps in place is that there's been a lot of stuff spoken, and some of it deflects from exactly what you're trying to achieve. And I've heard various things. I've had people here in the GNU saying, well, we were never consulted following the failed first attempt for the minister to do a budget speech. Thereafter, there was no communication, and the DA was just on the side there. There wasn't an attempt to galvanize the rest of the GNU so that everybody could speak with one voice. Because obviously, suddenly we had a whole lot of voices. But I mean, that would seem crazy to me. Surely you would have got all of those parties who agreed that the 2 percentage point increase wasn't a good idea. So I'm just sort of trying to get the sense here as to whether there was this attempt to come forward with a whole block, and then all of those people said no.
Sure. I think there are a couple of things to. Maybe if we're going to delve into what's happened, at the risk of, I think we need to be magnanimous in our victory, and it is what it is. But I don't think we need to keep harping on what. But because you asked the direct question, I'll try and answer it in this way. Mathematically, there was no option for the DA within the GNU not to agree with the budget, and for that budget to go ahead by means of the ANC finding support within the GNU for the budget. So let me unpack that a bit. So if the DA is out but everybody else is in, does the ANC have the numbers to pass the budget? The answer is no. They had to go seek support outside of the GNU. That includes BOSA, which is a 2-seat party in Parliament. It includes Action SA, which is a 6-seat party in Parliament. And so by seeking support outside of the GNU, they would be able to pass legislation from time to time, depending on how many seats have been filled in Parliament and so on. But mathematically, this thing is set up in a way that within the GNU, that's not possible. Now, to get to your question, we had perhaps erroneously assumed that when parties say that they wouldn't support a VAT-based budget, that they would in fact not support a VAT-based budget. And this is what's happened in this case. You had parties very clearly saying they'd never supported. We didn't consider it part of the acceptable conduct to seek support for anything outside of the GNU, and therefore didn't engage with those parties. And you ask another question. I hope I've now explained how the ANC was able to do this.
Yeah.
But you ask another question, which is, did we consult with the likes of the IFP in the lead up to this? The difficulty is the IFP was very firmly opposed to a 2% VAT increase, but somehow seemed amenable to going for a 0.5% VAT increase. And so the mind shift and the countenance shift that happened on their side from the failed first attempt of the budget to the second one, I can't speak for their reasons, but we simply didn't spend perhaps enough time analyzing each party's stated intent and its actual conduct. And that ended up with this situation. But I want to be clear also that what happened there was not to the benefit of South Africans. And while it happened there, and it wasn't to the benefit, it was also not to the benefit of the parties that did participate in that farcical vote. Part of what the court found here is that the process leading up to it, including the 9-hour committee meeting the day before, was not legally sound, and we tried to articulate this. So maybe to put it this way, we did try and find common cause with people who did then support the VAT increase. I don't know how much that would have served anybody. It was the fact that we tried to stay the line here that did avert this, this VAT increase.
But the point that I'm getting to is it would have seemed a lot stronger. At the end of the day, unless you're trying to just get the victory for the DA alone, but it surely would have been a lot of a stronger case to say all the other parties in the GNU oppose this, and we have all decided to agree on this program of action, rather than to turn this into a DA versus the rest situation, which it became, which sort of descended it into farce. The fact that that you had the court card in your back pocket is a separate issue. I just can't understand it, because it's not called politics for a joke. It's called politics for a reason. You need to win people over. You had everybody on your side. Surely the next step was to keep them on your side. And I'm trying to work out, was the fact that the ANC was so good at convincing them to support them, or that the DA were so bad or didn't even try to get these parties to support them in the follow-up action?
I can only say I agree with you. We could have done better to engage with parties in the GNU, at least, in this process. I think our federal leader has indicated as much over the last few days as well.
Yeah.
So it's perhaps a good point that we should spend more time. But I have explained it this way in the past, which is that sometimes when a friend that phones me that I haven't seen in a while wants to see me for dinner that evening, I simply don't have the time or the capacity. And I therefore focus on the most important relationships in my life, and I double down on those. But it doesn't mean that I don't value that friend. It simply means that within my existing bandwidth, it didn't feature. Now, I think we need to develop bandwidth, and we need to pursue these conversations with parties within the GNU.
Yeah.
But I would also say that we're all finding our feet in coalition territory.
Yeah.
And I don't think what's happened here has been a bad thing per se.
No, I think it's been a good thing, but that warning, that neon light that seems to follow the Democratic Alliance around of arrogance sort of starts flashing every time the DA decides to do something that isn't very consultative, and ends up being, I did a piece on this, I called it the red-headed stepchild that everybody can unload on. Why? Because they want to do everything alone. When you could get allies in this fight. I mean, it seemed like the Freedom Front Plus came along reluctantly, but there were a lot of other parties, and would have been quite interesting had it been an alliance position, an allied position, not just a DA position.
Yeah, I take your point. I think there's difficulty in that in South Africa, when we don't agree with somebody, we start labeling them.
Yeah.
I myself found myself being called rude and arrogant and a few other words simply for holding the line on this budget. And I think it's an unreasonable term to keep calling the DA arrogant for sticking to its principles, especially when it's the same people saying to us that in the GNU, you haven't been as strong, and, you're selling your soul for 6 executive seats. And it's the same people telling us, make your voice heard, that then tell us, oh, not in that tone, guys. That seems a bit arrogant to us. You mentioned the Freedom Front Plus coming along reluctantly. It's very interesting that they have 6 seats in Parliament. Only 5 of those 6 voted on the day. And the one conspicuous absence was the leader of that party, Dr. Corné Mulder. And we have to ask, why was the newly elected leader absent on such a crucial vote? Could have been valid, but it's still a question.
Okay, so let's roll forward. You then take up the lawsuit with an unlikely partner in the EFF. You've now won the case, but if we can go back one step before we get to the lawsuit, there's been a bit of confusion, and I follow this thing quite closely, as to whether you had made it conditional that you would support even an increase in VAT if you were given certain other concessions that fell outside of budgetary issues. Things like action on the NHI, Bella Act, Expropriation Act. I've heard 2 different versions, right? That what you were proposing was merely a financial thing and the problem that you had was procedural, or that you would have you would have endorsed this flawed procedure had you got your way on these other issues. Tell us, please, enlighten us. Did you ask for things that were outside of finance in order to support what was, as you've later proved, a flawed process?
I don't resent you for continuing to speak about what's happened, as long as through the course of our conversation today we get to what needs to happen.
Yes.
The answer to your question is almost back to the point I just made about the same people telling us, make your voice heard, then telling us that we're arrogant. There are people telling us that we shouldn't be arrogant and we should engage with the ANC and we should be willing to compromise. And then those same people are very upset when we say things like, if the hill that the ANC was willing to die on is a 0.5% VAT increase, that is the only thing they can count because that makes them feel strong or whatever I can't tell you the convoluted logic, but if that is what they need out of this negotiation, then we asked ourselves, how can we limit it in time and what concessions can we get for it in exchange? But what is not the case is that the DA was ever in favor of a VAT increase. We said, and I want to be very clear, Bello was never part of this conversation. We said, as it relates to growing the economy, which doesn't necessitate another conversation like this in the near future, let us get the concessions that will grow the economy. One of them being, let us make sure that the Richards Bay and Cape Town ports are devolved to a level of functionality. They are now some of the worst run ports in the world. And it is the case that a South African company is now taking its produce and putting it on the back of a truck, shipping it to Mozambique, getting it through the border, then paying for it to have a convoy of support as it travels through a country in conflict, only for it to be loaded up into a privately run South African port, Grindrod, in Mozambique, in shallow waters. What I've just described as insanity, and it's because our ports are not working. The ports are a massive bottleneck on our economy. Likewise, our rail system is broken, and Transnet's costing us between R500 million to R1 billion every month, and that's just the fiscal cost. Some experts indicate that the economic cost of Transnet not running as it should is about 400 billion rand a year. So you've got a problem here. The economy at a number of places is being bottlenecked and throttled, and we said as part of this engagement that we could support a budget to get across the line for the hill that the ANC is willing to die on. What can we get in exchange? And there were things in there, such as the devolution of rail and port. There were conversations had about NHI, which will have a massive fiscal effect and an economic effect if it is to go ahead under the framework which the Minister of Health has expounded upon. So yes, we did ask for concessions, and yes, we did take an open countenance willing to engage, but that was never our idea. It was something we would reluctantly support on a temporary basis if we were able to get economic concessions in return. And I think that speaks to a party that's willing to compromise. It speaks to a party that's willing to engage, but that's also very firm on what's needed so that we don't keep lurching from one crisis to the next.
Yeah, because, obviously it's worth bringing up just purely because it then makes it quite an interesting thing because you would have supported a process which you subsequently proved was illegitimate or illegal. If you got, I'm just saying it creates some kind of moral ambiguity as far as I see.
I don't follow your logic entirely, but perhaps I've misunderstood you. Let me explain it this way.
Yes.
Were we to support a fiscal framework that includes a temporary VAT increase in exchange for these economic concessions, the fiscal framework would either be supported in its current form, which wouldn't include these silly recommendations where, VAT will be in the fiscal framework, but it won't be in the fiscal framework, and recommendations that are non-binding, when the only thing that committee can do in law is either to amend the fiscal framework or to accept the fiscal framework. Now, if the contention is we got all the economic concessions we needed, we were able to implement a 0.5% VAT increase that was temporary in nature, then it couldn't include a 0.5 VAT increase the next year, which would require amending the fiscal framework in that committee, which would require 2 days for the minister to provide his comments, and the vote would have had to move out in Parliament with a day or two. So we would not have supported an illegal process for the purpose of railroading through a fiscal framework that didn't make sense. We would have insisted on that being done the right way. Now, incidentally, if you had to move Parliament by a day or two and the ANC and the DA were in alignment, it wouldn't be as big an issue because the ANC, of course, was looking at the dates, and it was saying, well, we've got 159 seats. We historically struggle to fill those seats. If the sitting does not happen tomorrow, the day after the committee, which doesn't leave 2 days for the minister to comment, then we might not have the vote, so let's railroad this thing through. Whereas if the DA and the ANC were in alignment, that problem would almost disappear. You could have 80% of your parliamentarians from the ANC there, and you'd still be able to pass it. So we wouldn't have had to resort to an illegal process if we did find alignment. That's just the facts of the law.
Right.
And in any case, the DA is not a party that disregards the law when it doesn't suit us. We will defend it with our dying breath, much as we'll defend the media with our dying breath. It's in our DNA. And so I just don't take the point that we would have gone with something that didn't make sense because it suited our political agenda.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So I think that we've dealt with what's past, and let's talk about where we go to from here. Because obviously the budget was an absurdity to anybody that understands numbers. You've got this bloated bureaucracy, 700 state-owned companies, cadre deployment, BE tax, levy, I suppose you should call it, tariff. That's the right word, BE tariff, which costs us, I presume, about 50% on our procurement, somewhere crazy like that. And now we're a struggling country with no growth. Right, so now that you've got your court victory, right, and this whole process goes back to the drawing board, will some sanity prevail? Will there be some discussion on a better budget?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of areas where it's definitely not the DA's version of the budget yet, but in a lot of ways, the shift from consumption spending to infrastructure spending is very positive. We still have to ask questions on the value for that infrastructure spend. The fact that we're not cutting back on critical frontline services that we do need, I think these are positive developments. And on the whole, there might be line items within the appropriations bill, which is part of this budget, that there will be some contention on, and we will have to find ways to resolve that contention. But on the whole, I don't look at this budget and think this is patently bad. But what is the problem in South Africa, as you've now pointed out, is 30 years of a particular policy has resulted in so much inefficiency in the way that the states run. So I'll give you just one example. We've got these CETAs, which are meant to be these training authorities. It's about 19 billion rand in our budget. It could be amalgamated and then scrapped within a number of weeks if there was the political will to do so. But of course, it's a place where people take benefit. I don't mean people who should be training at these, institutions. The people that run them benefit from them. And at every juncture where you find inefficiency, you also find benefactors of that inefficiency. And the interest that you're going up against is that. So we spoke earlier a bit about the concessions we were demanding in exchange for this high price of a temporary VAT increase. And one of them was a spending review tied to actionable outcomes. So we've had expenditure reviews within departments over time, but a comprehensive spending review at the scale that we envisage has never been done in South Africa. So let's maybe just touch on what that means. You say, as you've now mentioned, there's more than 700 state-owned enterprises, but you've also got overlapping departments within government. So you've got, one department doing the work of another department, both of them employing boards, sometimes more board members than employees. That's insane. And the difficulty is politicians love unveiling new programs. That gets the headline. But I've heard, I think it was Ronald Reagan that said in a speech in the 70s that the closest thing we might witness to internal life on Earth is a government department or organization that's been spun up. Yeah. And I couldn't agree more. It seems that we just don't have the ability to wind these things down once they've been started. And so a spending review would say, clinically, what needs to go? And it's our anticipation that we could save between 50 to 100 billion rand at least within a year of conducting such a spending review. But it cannot be another South African set of recommendations, much like the Zondo Commission, that doesn't lead to any actionable outcomes. If we were able to get that right, you do two things. You start creating fiscal breathing room by cutting back on this overlapping bureaucracy. But two, and perhaps more exciting, is that you won't have outdated government departments forcing down regulation that stifles innovation. Because in South Africa, it's often the case for you to produce anything, for you to provide any service. You need this license and that concession. And those things take time and they cost money and they disincentivize people from actually producing. And so when we start stripping back at these government departments and entities, we also start stripping back at the sprawling bureaucracy that inhibits growth.
Yeah.
And those are the things that the DA is really excited about.
Yeah, because, it's something that I've railed against so hard, because really what you're talking about is red tape. And here's your third part. The third part is the actual business, on the other hand, that actually has to do all of these things, comply with this bullshit legislation, right, ad nauseum.
Sure.
So, yeah, we need that, because, it's just crazy. And it's not like there's no precedent. So perhaps what we should do is buy you a chainsaw, because that seems to be the popular thing in the world, because that's kind of what Milei has done in Argentina. To a degree, it's what's happened in the States, even though it's a more clumsy version of it. But cost cutting has to come. But we've already had the ANC Secretary General saying that the ANC doesn't cut. Now, I presume that's his line, but he's got many lines. He can change it by the day. But one of the real stumbling blocks appeals to be this dinosaur called Enoch Godongwana. Does he still have a role to play in South African politics? Because he doesn't look like it to me.
It's a difficult question to answer.
Am I asking the wrong person? Because you have to diplomatically sidestep that question.
It's my principle never to diplomatically sidestep anything. I can apply my mind as best I can, perhaps with the caveat that I'm not the decision maker of what the DA calls for over time. But Helen Zille summarized it very well last week. She was asked, should the finance minister go? And she said, the difficulty is if I say that he should resign, he definitely won't. And so I'd almost encourage him to stay and see where that goes. I think there were a bunch of errors made over the last couple of months that could have been entirely avoided. But I don't want to let South Africa let the largest party off the hook by scapegoating one individual. The fact of the matter is people voted for that fiscal framework. So if their moral conscience dictated so strongly to them that we should not have a 1% VAT increase over 2 years, then there wasn't one vote from the minister. There was 155 votes from the ANC. And likewise with these smaller parties. Again, I don't want to keep harping on about what happened, but it's too easy to take one individual and say this is the problem. I think over time, as far as ANC politicians go, and this is now predating what's just happened over the last 2 months, Minister Godongwana has from time to time been a reasonable voice that focused on fiscal responsibility. Let's just touch on the audience for what fiscal responsibility means. It means saying that at the moment, we are spending 22 rand out of every 100 on servicing our debt.
Oh, sorry, we're going to get our debt clock right now up on the screen, because this is my favorite thing, yeah.
But our debt is increasing year on year. So you could make the argument that our servicing of debt is in fact just interest payments. And so we are spending almost a quarter now of all revenue at our disposal on servicing debt, which means we are not spending it on things that we've discussed are beneficial, such as infrastructure investment. And what you would want in an environment like that is somebody who doesn't pretend like it's okay to keep borrowing so that your debt service cost will be even higher next year and you'll crowd out even more essential spending to a point where you end up in a debt spiral. And South Africa is not able to repay the people that have lent it money, which, by the way, are mostly domestic bondholders. People like you and I saving for retirement, where our fund manager then decides to put the money into government bonds yielding 12 or 13% instead of a FNB money market account offering 7%. So South Africans, pensioners, people saving for their financial future, will suffer when South Africa becomes a country that's not able to pay for its debt. So you'd want somebody to say, guys, this is a problem. We're not going to keep doing this because it's crowding out spending in the short term, and it's a real danger for South Africa's financial future in the long term. And on that measure, Minister Godongwana hasn't done too poorly. Now, there's an open question in politics as to how long you should stay. I've just recently entered politics. I've been in Parliament for about 10 months now, and I've come in from the private sector. And this isn't true across the board, but I would say we need more people to cycle into politics for 5 or 10 years at a time and then cycle out. And you'd want people who have an alternative to cycle out to that enter into politics, because I think one of the big curses of the 20th century was the introduction of a professional politician that has no viable career outside of politics. And so then you get to the question of, when have people overstayed their welcome? And I'm not saying particularly for the Minister of Finance that's so, but I would say there's a concentration of individuals that have just been around for too long. I mean, we have people now sitting in Parliament that were also part of Parliament before we were a democratic country. You know, that just seems to me a really long time to sit on those benches.
Yeah, and there's the debt clock. And just so people can understand, South Africa pays over 400 billion rand a year in debts, in interest. Now, there's more than R1 billion every day, just in interest payments. That's not paying that debt down. And we can see it rising so nicely.
It's shocking. Have I diplomatically sidestepped your question?
You have diplomatically sidestepped my question, but I think you did answer it very well. Well done, Mark. And the real question, I suppose, then is much like your own experience, where you've got experience of the real world. You've been in the private sector, but you also now sit on the Standing Committee on Finance. And, you know, I've made this point many times that in this whole discussion, we've heard almost zero discussion around growth, right? Economic growth. And you get the feeling that it's so absent that people don't understand what that is. Are you finding that within that committee, people actually understand what economic growth is, how it could be generated, what's needed to grow our economy? Because I'm not seeing it.
Well, perhaps before we remark on the people in the committee and their understanding of economic growth, let's just unpack it a bit for where we're at and where Treasury thinks we're at, which is a part of the problem here. So the latest numbers at our disposal became available between the first failed budget attempt at the start of February and the second, which is now clearly also failed. And that indicated that our economic growth last year was 0.6%. Now, Treasury had, within its first budget, forecasted economic growth of 1.9%. And when asked about this, I asked them in the Standing Committee of Finance on the second attempt. They said, they didn't have enough time with the print deadlines to update their economic forecast. Now, the difficulty is, to an extent, our budget is a function of our economic activity. You know, you could never have a bigger budget than you have GDP. In fact, it'll also always be a portion of it. And when you overestimate, which, by the way, Treasury over the last 15 years or so, I think 80% of the time, has incorrectly calculated. And they've not only incorrectly calculated economic growth, they've always incorrectly calculated in the wrong direction. So they've always overestimated, which is to the benefit of people who want to spend more. Because if you overestimate economic growth, you could say, well, a portion of that's going into the budget and therefore we could spend this much. But it's not to the benefit of our fiscal situation. And needs to be rectified post-fact every time. So we've got clear economic growth data from last year saying it's 0.6%. Serious organizations like the IMF have just in the last week said to us, it's not going to be any more than 1% in the year ahead.
Can I just interrupt you there? I think the IMF have equally overstated our growth, even though it wasn't as bad as Treasury. But they've also been on the same boat of overestimating our growth.
So the optimistic guys are saying it will be 1%. And we still have it pegged at 1.9%. So we need to have a serious conversation about the fact that the economy is not going in the right direction, and therefore any estimates of budget based on that will run into issues. Now the question is, how do you get the economy going, and what can you do about it? The DA is very clear on what we think will unlock economic growth. We've got these bottlenecks that I've mentioned earlier. We've got regulation getting in the way. But we also have, across the board, just an undermining of business interest in South Africa for the sake of, I'm almost at the point where it looks to me that there's a camp of people who are on the inside, you know, civil servants who've gotten the job, who's getting disproportionate pay to, you know, what other governments elsewhere in the world spend as a portion of their total budget on their civil service, but also gets overpaid in proportion to what people actually get paid in South Africa. And that group of people, let's call it 1.3 million people, doesn't care too much about, you know, the 32% of unemployment that we've got. And so we're in a place where economic growth is not heading in the right direction. There's a select few who's benefiting from the system as it is, but the majority of people, and this is a real problem for the following reasons, Mike. Across the country, perhaps with the exception of Cape Town and one or two other places, house values are deteriorating year on year, which means your house is going to be worth less than it was last year, and that's been the case for most of the last 5 years. So people are looking at the biggest asset in their lives and going like it's losing value. And then at the same time, young people, my peer group, are looking at their situation and saying, I'm probably going to be poorer than my parents were. But it's a very depressing prospect. Nobody wants to live in a society where you don't at least have the anticipation of progress. And so unless we're able to start chipping away at some of the regulations, ideology, and policy that gets in the way of this economy taking off, and let's just be clear, I do believe it can take off. I believe we've got so much nascent potential here, both in our people and our resources. And we need to get that out of the way. Otherwise, economic growth will stagnate. And we'll be in the same position, if not worse, in a year from now.
Yeah, and then to add to your synopsis, which I think is on the money, you've got a government that by definition doesn't believe that black people are capable of running their own economic affairs or creating businesses or creating value. So they need to be infantilized in a business sense. Right, which obviously is not helping anybody, because really what the laws, the way they read, and then the real sort of action is going to be to say, you are not good enough to start your own business, therefore you must get a portion of somebody's business who is good enough to run a business. You aren't good enough to make the case to the bank to get a finance there. We're going to raise money and give you the money. You say it's a complete infantilization of the majority of South Africans, which I certainly don't see. But certainly the government must see a whole lot of black people incapable of running their own businesses. And I don't understand. And obviously we're getting, it's become a less popular issue amongst young black people who feel that they do have the ability. And the government just stands in the way. And in actual fact, all their actions just empower their mates. But I mean, that can't be helping us as well, because that's where our real engine of growth would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I lived in the UK for a number of years. That's where I met my lovely wife. And I realized while living there how race-obsessed our society is in South Africa. It's just not within the frame of reference when discussing anything, policy or person, anywhere in the UK. Whereas it's part of most discussions here. I think your bigger question is on BEE, not on black South Africans. But I take the point that you're making. The thing that I would encourage, and that I think people my age are very keen on, is that we stop using the terms that don't apply to us anymore, including, empowerment, whatever that word means, or transformation, whatever that word means. And we start talking about creating opportunity for people. Now, some of the policies that you've now described, having to hand over a certain size, a portion of your business to a class of people, which, by the way, is very often a select few that already have extensive business interests. That's not going to people who are historically poor and are not finding themselves advancing financially. So the policies, be that BEE, be it, race-based legislation of any kind, be it land expropriation, whatever policies that are based on this idea that government knows better how to create opportunity than business and individuals do, I think just doesn't find resonance in the real world anymore. And so if we can maybe strip away some of the language that is so incendiary around this and say that the thing that's getting in the way here is government thinking it has an outsized role to play with limited resources, that's a problem. It is getting in the way of opportunity for people. And people are yearning to either be part of this class of people who, and I would argue that if you were part of that 1.3 million civil servant class, there's not a lot of meaning in it. You might have financial stability, but showing up for a job that does nothing but get in the way of other people will get quite boring and life draining after a couple of months of getting a solid salary. And so I think people are yearning both for opportunities and for an environment that doesn't get in their way. And if we can start focusing our attention there, I think it strips away a lot of the historical, weight of some of these concepts and starts focusing on what needs to be done and how it can be done. You asked a question earlier about some of the people in the committee. I've been really encouraged across parties that there are some very intellectual people that, even though they wear a certain color or, form part of a certain organization are able to think of what they think is best for South Africa. And some people genuinely believe that in some sectors the state should play a bigger role. And that's fine if we have the right mechanisms in place to contain the corruption that often goes with the state dominating an industry. And I'm happy to have those conversations with people to try and figure out, for example, if we say need to devolve our rail, maybe that doesn't look like selling the rail network, but maybe it looks like a 20 or 50-year lease instead of a 5-year lease, which no private rail operator is able to make the investment needed on the back of a 5-year lease. But hey, if you start talking about a 50-year lease where the government actually still owns the asset, but the company gets to operate it in a cost-effective, efficient way, man, like, that's just good for South Africa. And what I've just said is not political. Yes. It's sensible.
And it happens all over the world. We saw with the whole port outsourcing thing, which in true South African form hit the rocks. But that would be the idea, isn't it? You and I run the port. We're using the infrastructure that was there. We're improving on it, servicing it, maintaining it, and it grows. So, Mark, you've been a wonderful guest here, telling us how the whole story has unfolded, and some of your, some of the what you guys are standing for. The question is, as we close, is where to from here with this process? Because I think by now we were all sort of wanting to see, and as we record this, the court has ruled against. We've got that. What did you call it? The draft ruling, right? Striking down the VAT increase. But now we've got the framework, which needs to be redone, one would imagine, and re-voted on. Is that right? Is that correct?
Yep.
And the DA is still very much part of that, I'd imagine, because it's back to square one.
That's right,
if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, let's perhaps. One of the cool things that's happened over the last couple of weeks is South Africans have become a lot more sensitized to what goes into making a budget.
Yep.
Something that was assumed for the last 30 years is now very contested.
Myself included.
And I think that's an excellent development. It speaks to a nation that cares about how we're going to try and move forward.
Yeah. It's also alerted us to actually where the money goes to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're starting to have some real conversations of which holy cows can now be slaughtered for the benefit of the country. Things that, before were inconceivable to even talk about. The DA has proposed a number of spending mechanisms over time that's now very much part of the mainstream discourse in this. So I think it's excellent. It can be a bit nerdy, it can be a bit academic, what needs to happen, but almost like when a war breaks out somewhere, most South Africans are now an expert on the budget process. and I think that's a good development. So maybe to just talk, at a very zoomed out level, talk about what happens now and what needs to happen. So if you read the law on how a budget is passed, the minister comes to Parliament and he makes a speech, and that speech in law can best be understood as a proposal. He puts on the table a number of areas of focus. He talks about where money will come from and where it'll go towards. And then democracy requires that majority support in Parliament would have to be involved in each of the crucial decisions that signs off on the minister's proposal, or either changes then the proposal when it doesn't accept it. So I explain it to people this way. There's effectively 3.5 boxes after the minister has tabled his proposal. 3.5 steps, if you will. The first half a step is perhaps the most important. It's the most integral part of the budget, which is the fiscal framework. And it says we are going to get our revenue from here, and we're going to spend on, these broad categories. And within revenue, it says how much of it has to come from taxation and how much of it has to come from borrowing. And so that report that passes through the Standing Committee on Finance is called the Fiscal Framework and Revenue Proposals Report. So it says very clearly in the report where the revenue has to come from, including if from a VAT increase, which now won't happen. It says that. And then the pieces of legislation that comes after is tethered to that box. So once it's been voted on in Parliament, that report almost dictates what happens next. But then there are 3 more bills that have to pass through Parliament. The first is called the Division of Revenue, and it talks about how much money is going to the national sphere of government, how much is going to the provincial sphere, and how much is going to the local sphere. And after the Division of Revenue, you've got the appropriations bill, which says within the national sphere and within departments, which one is getting how much. So Home Affairs might get this amount and Correctional Services might get that amount and so on. And then finally, you've got the rates bill. It's got a long name, but it says how does tax law need to change to facilitate what's now been discussed. And technically that rates bill could come a bit sooner, but it makes the most sense for it to follow after these things have been done. And so that process on a good day takes 2 to 3 months, and we are now squarely back at the first half a step, which is looking at this fiscal framework. We hope that when it comes to committee, people would now have come to their senses. They will take the time needed. We won't be rash in any decisions we make. And a logical process can follow. And I think touching on the first point we made on this particular part of our conversation, I think South Africans are now very alert to what's going on. And there is a public participation process in the steps that I've now described. And this is the moment for South Africans to organize themselves and have their voice heard. It was our experience that 97% of the participants that did come into the fiscal framework conversation indicated that they were against VAT. And that was one of our strong drawing cards when we were having these conversations, saying serious people like the Institute for Chartered Accountants is telling us not to do this. And so that's a prime opportunity for South Africans to get involved, to have their voice heard, and for democracy to work the way it should, which is that no party gets to have their way, but between them they can try and find consensus on the best way forward.
Well, Mark, I tell you, what gives me a lot of hope, and I've said this before, I think that South African politics following the earth-shattering outcomes of the 2024 general election might be that our politics skips 2 generations, skipping over the struggle generation and the lot that came in with them, and goes straight to the next generation that are maybe not 100% born free, but are modernist, grew up with social media, grew up in a modern world, and can make South Africa a better place. And I, for one, welcome it. And there is no doubt that sitting with us is somebody that represents that. Mark Burke, thank you so much for joining us on the State of the Nation. We definitely want you back here again. I hope we didn't grill you too hard on some of those other issues about how we got to the trouble. But thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Pace Car Rental that sponsor us and keep us on the air. Remember, rent a car from them, use a code SONA and get a discount. Mark, thank you. To everybody that enjoyed this, please subscribe to the channel. We'll see you again on the State of the Nation. Thank you.